we don't have to build a factory that's so general purpose that anyone could use it.
Right.
We just need one that builds things the way we want them to be built, right?
The end goal is not, oh, we're just going to complete stuff automatically and never look at it. It's more, we're going to stretch time and budgets more by increasing what we can accomplish.
Today I'm sitting down with Dave Lane and Jami Couch, the CEO and CTO of Twin Sun, a Nashville software agency. Twin Sun is an early practitioner of something a lot of people are trying to figure out right now, the dark factory. That's a software development pipeline where AI agents handle most of the work, writing code, reviewing pull requests, and running tests, all with minimal human intervention. In this conversation, you will learn the lessons that they learned. The big one, you can't design the whole system and just flip it on. You have to introduce one piece at a time, run it manually until you trust it, and only then let it go dark. Another great lesson is don't build a general purpose factory. Build your factory. It's a lot easier to make the factory dependable if you constrain the agent to follow the existing patterns that your company uses to write code. We'll cover plenty of other topics as well. How their PR review bot went from optional advice to autonomously approving 70% of pull requests, how they got buy-in from their development team, the challenges that they're working through with visual design review. We'll even talk about how the factory can be applied to other business objectives with a dark factory, such as marketing. Let's dive in. All right, the thing I wanted to get started with was, how did we get here? I am John Berryman. I am an independent consultant at Arcturus Labs, and I focus on AI product engineering. I'm like equal parts product and engineer. I really love making the system, but also using this crazy new tool that we've got. It's the first tool that humans have made that we can speak to and it speaks back. Can't do that with a hammer. But as a consultant, I've been kind of locked away for a while. I do my own thing. I help clients out, but as an individual, it's in series. And I miss being on a team. And it occurred to me, there's all these videos on YouTube about Claude Code and how to write code as an individual. And it occurred to me that I'm actually missing out on the cool developments and the team experience and what is happening to the companies right now. So I tossed out a question on LinkedIn that was actually got a lot of good conversation going, where it's basically, what do people do now? What are the new processes that are being developed so that you can actually plan the product and build the thing so that you don't have a bunch of developers stepping on each other's toes and building the same thing twice. So you don't have like anarchy, so that you can review the code. Like some people are like, no, it's humans read every line, but my gosh, there's a lot of lines right now. What are the tools, the skills, the disciplines that are evolving? And like, how are the roles shaping up? Like the engineer, as I always knew it in the dark ages, 2022 and earlier, that doesn't quite exist anymore. That's quickly going out of existence. But I think something more interesting is coming to replace it. So all these questions in mind, it occurred to me, rather than being sad, I'm a consultant, I'm just locked up in one project after another. It's like, I'm supposed to be doing content anyways. So why not just start interviewing people and get the experience from everybody about what's changing, figure out the pain points, figure out what's working and what's not, and everyone learn together. So today I'm welcoming Jami Couch and Dave Lane from Twin Sun. Greetings, fellas. Maybe start off, why don't you guys tell us about yourselves individually, but also about your role in Twin Sun and what Twin Sun does. Jami, would you like to go first?
Yeah, a little bit about me individually. So I've been at Twin Sun for 8 years now, which is feels like a very long time when I say it, but it hasn't felt like that being there. I actually grew up in Franklin, Tennessee, in the area, and I got a PhD in biochemistry from Vanderbilt back in 2014, and then decided to take a different path than that would normally lead to. Ended up at a software development agency here in town, working for Dave actually, and then, several years later, joined Twin Sun and have been kind of rolling there. So I've been the CTO, going from a four person partner only business all the way to we've got a full team now. So I'm not generally developing on client projects anymore, but more facilitating, making sure the team has what they need to be successful, investigating, how should we be incorporating this AI thing that's going on, that sort of thing. And so, that also does leave me some time though to be able to experiment with new things and, come up with ideas and go, hey guys, look at this thing, maybe this would work, that sort of thing. So for me, I think seeing the AI tools develop it's very exciting because as someone who's not doesn't always have their hands on the keyboard anyway, like you're saying, it's a tool that you can speak to and it speaks back, but it also makes things for you when you speak to it, which is really cool.
And you guys were both really early on in playing with this stuff too. I do AI Tinkers Nashville, and both you guys had some really cool demos for the earlier meetings. I think Jamie, yours was actually chatting. This was way back. This is a year ago, which is way back these days. But you
Ancient
chatted on
times.
Slack. You chatted on Slack and had the Slack bot talk to, I guess it was Claude Code, an early Claude Code,
Mhm.
and rewrite the Slack bot itself and redeploy itself to do something silly. I forget what it was, but it actually worked in like a 3-minute demo. It's wow,
Yeah,
stuff really
that
does
was
work.
like that was like the first time. So Dave and I have a joke that anything we're working on, Anthropic is like a month away from releasing a better version of it. And so that was probably the first instance of that. It's like, oh, this cool thing. And then a few months later, Anthropic comes out with, here's the, Claude GitHub app. You just do @Claude and it will run Claude code in a sandbox instance and send you a pull
No. This is why this year I'm dedicating myself to get content out quicker, because every once in a while, like, oh, that's a great idea. I'll write it when I have time. And then it's like I'm following instead of
Yeah.
leading, but not actually write it. Dave,
Yeah.
how's it going?
Yeah. Well, Jamie kind of left out. We actually met in college, and he instantly, I was like, this is the brightest guy I've ever met. Like, just a genius. And so then he was like, I'm not going to keep doing computer science, and went off and got his PhD and all that. But I I went to school at Tennessee Tech for computer science. Quickly got a job during the BlackBerry era, so dating myself a bit there. And I would still kill for one of those keyboards. But I worked for the agency where Jamie eventually joined us. But I got in, I think I was the eighth employee, and we grew that team to 150 people. 130 engineers reported up through the engineering organization with us. So I moved up from, ground floor developer to CTO. And I recall, being fascinated with automation that far back. And one day I had a company talk where I was like, here's where I think we should go. We should generate the interfaces, the libraries that we use on client side applications from our web apps just automatically. I was like, there's so much we could do just right away on every project if we just, built our own tools around generating this code. And this was like 2014 or something. And I remember one of the developers sheepishly raised their hand and was like, you're talking about automating our jobs. And I was like, no, like I'm not. And that's been something interesting just seeing with industry lately and all the layoff excuses around, oh, well, AI, we can be more efficient. It's like you could also just grow your capabilities with this stuff. And that's really what I wanted all this time. And then finally, we get this new class of tooling a few years ago, and it's fantastic. But yeah, now I'm CEO of Twin Sun. We're a software development agency here in Nashville. We pride ourselves on being the best. We own it, so of course we think we're the best. But our tagline is we're fast, fearless, and fully US based. So we take these decades of software development experience we've got, apply it to prioritizing goals for software projects, and get stuff in people's hands quickly and let them see a working system that improves every day. We've done all kinds of stuff. Speaking to Fearless, we've deployed custom Android kernels to submarines, not that submarine, not the one you're thinking about, but also deployed firmware to satellites and everything in between. We've done, hundreds of projects over our careers. And so the appeal of software factories was immediate for us. We saw a lot of opportunity to get a lot more done and saw general applicability of this stuff. So that's kind of where we're at today. And I know we're going to talk about that a bit, but it's really, I think, come down to having discipline and having all those best practices that software developers have been talking about for years has enabled us to adopt agents in general and also a software factory. I don't think without that discipline you can do it well, and we need to do it well.
Outstanding. Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good segue to get into the meat of it then. Like, you guys have seen my questions. I reiterated some of them at the beginning. Like, I'm interested in how things are changing, hopefully, so I can provide people some advice, provide companies advice in navigating those changes. And you guys are interested in a piece of this that is gaining a lot of attention right now, the factory or the dark factory or the somewhat translucent factory, depending on, I guess, how much you get into it. Tell me what this factory pattern is and break it down for me. What are the salient pieces of it? What's working? What's not?
You want to
Where to
take a shot,
begin?
Jamie? Or,
All
yeah.
right. So, as you know, recently Strong DM uh, published the idea of this dark factory. They had, I think, kind of two rules, which were humans should not write code and humans should not read code. And then, tokens are kind of the thing that makes this happen, which is a really interesting idea. I think I think this was probably around, maybe a month or so after Claude 4.5 Opus dropped, because I think that was kind of seems to be the turning point where letting it rip autonomously kind of starts working a little bit better.
I think the notice that is like last November, December
Right.
time
Yeah,
frame.
something like that. It's pretty, really recent, really. It's like within the last 6 months, and it's like
Right.
old news. When are we
Dilation.
getting the next release?
Yeah.
But yeah, so taking that idea, they've since published more things about they published this attractor pattern, which is kind of like a statement of how they expect the factory to work in terms of, an acyclic graph. And I forget which, you know, graph representation language they use, but I think for us, one of the big unlocks, in terms of being able to potentially make this successful is, like Dave mentioned, having a strong process in place, having strong disciplines for for Opus or Cloud Code to follow. That way, you're not uh, kind of you give it a framework, in other words, to build upon, rather than kind of letting it choose and it does it haphazardly, and maybe the decisions don't always make sense, with each other as it makes them independently, and then you get, kind of the vibe coded mess that everyone warns about. So the way to avoid that, I mean, we can talk a lot about this, but the way to avoid that is with that strong process discipline and having really good guardrails in place for it. But it's been really interesting. I think the way we've kind of gone about it is, and I think what the way to have success in a world where things are moving so quickly, and the next model turn, who knows what it's going to bring, it might make everything you've built completely obsolete, is really, I think, focusing on doing a thing well. So, for us, we don't have to build a factory that's like so general purpose that anyone could use it.
Mhm.
We just need one that builds things the way we want them to be built, right? And that's a way, that's the twin sun way, for lack of a better term. We don't need to do it, this company's way or that company's way or whatever. We just need to do it our way. And then it works for us and we can get good results about it and kind of get ahead of the curve a little bit, maybe.
I think
So
one
that's,
really good example of iterating on that one thing well is our pull request process.
yes.
Um, so Jamie, over a year ago, I think, introduced what we call Twin Sum Dev, our PR bot, and it's quad code behind the scenes, running prompt that he's iterated on over time. The team has given feedback to, but pull requests are in the agency world are a little difficult at times. We work on a lot of projects concurrently. We have a lot of small teams, one or two person dev teams. So outside of the coding conventions we have and the frameworks we typically use, most people on our team don't have a lot of context about everyone else's applications. So when you think about what's the goal of a PR review, for us, it's one, we want to know we're following same coding conventions and it's comprehensible. But two, we also want to ensure we're implementing the thing that was specified. Like, is the work implemented properly? Does it make sense in this business domain? And what we started recognizing as we rolled out this automated PR reviewer is based on the task specification and the information it could pull about a project, it often had better context than most of the team about what a pull request was for. So over time, it started feeling like the human review was just a distraction and taking time away from folks when Twin Sun Dev could do a lot of the work. And that was driven largely by their feedback and iterating and saying, it does this. We don't really do things that way, or it hallucinated this. We need to figure out something around that. But over time, it went from this optional review step you could add into PRs to now, I think within a week of allowing it to approve pull requests on its own, something like 70%, I think, Jimmy, of pull requests were approved by Twin Sun Dev. And now most projects, that is the PR process. And so that fell right into place in a workflow step in our factory. But it's that openness and iteration and trying to enhance a thing over time that really became the powerful unlock for us in code reviews and changing how we look at PRs now. So, yeah.
So interesting. I definitely want to dig into this in a little bit because there's everyone's trying everything at once. So there's obviously different camps. Some people are like, it doesn't ship unless a human's laid eyes on code, which, like, my logical conclusion is like, I know what your humans are doing all day long. That's not very motivating either. But before we dig into that, I want to dig into the PRs. I want to dig into all the pieces. I want to dig into the opinions that you were talking about, Jamie, because that's important in making it work really well. But I'm going to feign ignorance and actually demonstrate ignorance that's valid and true. Help me understand at a more basic level what the factory is. What are the components of the factory? What are the nodes and like decision blocks? What comes out of the factory? I pretty much know, but put that into words because that'll be pieces that we can hang later conversation on too.
I think like the easiest analogy I have is like if you're a software developer, you're familiar with like a Kanban board or a Jira board and having, concrete steps in a workflow. So you specify a task, it gets prioritized, and then you have, maybe a development stage or design stage. Let's say design, then you go through development of the task. Then you have review steps. It might be a pull request. It could be internal team review of a feature. It could be a client or stakeholder review of a feature. And then you have promotion to production. So all those workflow stages require certain tasks to be performed. And traditionally, a lot of those have been human tasks, or it may be your CI/CD environment where GitHub Actions trigger workflows that run tests, and then it does a deployment if the tests pass. So a software factory is basically our attempt at automating many of the tasks and steps in that workflow. So basically, our factory, as it stands today, starts with the task specification. We enter tasks like you would enter them in Tickets and Jira. We actually use Jira still. And then the workers...
Use Jira to make the specification?
Yes. Now, we do use like the Atlassian MCP and things like that to help with, speccing some things en masse and things. But yeah, we use Jira and Jamie tied that into the factory to look at what work is available. Then we have work delegated to runners that are running Claude Code agents, and they review the plan, implement the task, and then it goes through our workflow of, PR review. So we have automated tests, a practice, again, we've had for years, security checks, accessibility checks, and all that feedback gets returned to the developer agent if things don't pass muster. So the agent gets that context, built a new plan for finishing the implementation, goes back through review and testing and all that, and ultimately gets merged into the main code line if all that passes and can fire off deployments.
And is the merging and deployment, that's all automated too at this point?
We do have it configurable per project. So there are some where like, okay, we can let it rip. There are some, untested applications we bring in, like they need a lot of love before we can really let it loose. But yeah, Jamie, you're about to talk, I think, on that point.
Yeah, I was going to say, so one, before we leave the code review thing entirely, I want to give a lot of props to the team. They've actually been the ones driving that. I kind of had an idea initially, and then Justin on our team has done, I think, most of the implementation of that kind of stuff, and Jack as well, been working together to kind of, revise it over time and make it into something that's, yeah, it went from being advisory all the way to now. Not only is it, the only approver on most of our pull requests, but it also enforces some of our conventions. So one of the things we've really been pushing for lately is our like Rails and backend generally, our testing has always been excellent. That's something that's always been part of our culture. Our front ends, a little less sometimes. Things are moving fast there. We use Flutter, which has Dart, which is a strongly typed language. So you already have kind of the type safety there a lot of times. So that, catches a lot of the bugs that you would catch with testing in like a Rails app with like interface mismatch kinds of things. But um, we wanted to improve our testing game. And so now it's at the point where if there's a pull request that it looks at and it's like that should have tests, it will tell you, it'll reject it. Like, no, you got to add tests.
That's cool. And there's a separation of concerns too. Because it sounds like the node, the agent that is responsible for actually building the code, better be writing the test, because the PR bot is very specialized at judging the code, but not at like
Right.
fixing stuff.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't fix anything. It just goes, this is good or bad. And so that I think was kind of the fundamental starting point for the factory, which is, I can code locally with Claude Code, get good results, have this code reviewer review it, even use the GitHub CLI to say, okay, Claude, get the feedback off of here and address it. It's like, okay, let's encode that into a factory now. And so to Dave's point, this is in its early days. So I've spent a lot of time with it because we call our factory Scarif, which we can go into why that name for historical reasons in a minute if we want. But it has essentially built itself after just a little bit of bootstrapping locally, to get to the point where it has this worker agent and a way to, do just basic stuff going through the pipeline, and then, built itself up from there. Now it still requires someone to specify things. So my typical workflow is, you know, Claude Code and I have a conversation about what our priorities should be. I have this idea, what do you think? Or go look at all of the, stages that have run in the past couple of days and see what you think, what could be more efficient, what could be better, what are we missing, all that kind of stuff. Produce a plan from that, and then break that into stories, put it into Jira, and then queue up all of those stories into Scarif, and then Scarif's going to run them through. And kind of to Dave's point, it's going to start with, nowadays it actually starts with a planning stage. So it's going to take the ticket, break it into its own plan, make sure it understands generally how it's going to implement things. It's looking at the code, what its acceptance criteria are, that sort of thing, feed that forward into an implement step, and it's going to implement. And then separately, it's going to do a code review, which is very closely based on that initial code review agent. And then from there, it's going to actually separately evaluate the review. Go, okay, based on these findings, here was our initial plan with acceptance criteria. Is this good, or do we need to go back and revise it? And so one of the important things about this is it's not an acyclic graph. So
Right,
there are
right, right.
some, there's like a
It
cycle
isn't.
counter. So it's like, all right, once you get to like 5 cycles, probably need a human to look at this. But so it will go back and do it again and come through, all those stages, implement, review, and then evaluate again. Then once the evaluator signs off, then it goes into verify, which is basically make sure the CI checks pass. And from there, there's kind of to Dave's point, the decision point of, I run this thing. I don't have time to look at all this code it's generating. So I just let it go. And if something's broken, we'll log more tasks to fix it. But I think we've had a couple of teams use this a little bit, and they're not quite so, they're the ones, they have the thing they have to like go show their clients at the end, so they're not quite ready for the just fully autonomous deploying things all the way to volatile that they haven't looked at yet kind of stuff. So there is a decision point there where it can, once it's verified, it can just wait for a human review, to say, okay, good, merge, versus I should do that on camera, I guess, versus automatically merging and moving on to the next thing. So there is kind of a, nod to the developer sensibilities as we're kind of moving up the automation chain here. Um, the what I will say is code review is something that Claude is very good at. And especially in a context like this, where if it needs to, it can kind of run the app and those sorts of things. There's a test suite that it can run, all of that. And we can get into this. I forget what the original question was, so I apologize for rambling. But the design review and implementation has been kind of an interesting challenge.
The big question that I really wanted to make sure we had drawn on the board behind me is here is how the whole system works. And let me see if I've got this straight. And you can correct me if I don't. So Scarif is one unified system that has different skill sets. And I'm gonna get a little bit of this wrong, but if I get it like blatantly wrong, let's jump in. We'll edit it out. At the start is the ideation process. This is where, and I'm interested in where humans touch. That's part of this too. Ideation, my client has a concern. I'm like a product engineer, like hybrid right now. And so I say, okay, I know it's feasible with technology. I'm going to converse with maybe with Scarif. Is Scarif helping with the ideation? Is that
Not yet. I think that's probably going to be in the long-term plan, but it's not doing that just yet. It's
Okay, so that's
still
interesting.
after the ideation phase. Yeah.
That might be interesting to see if I was to come in and ideate, I bet the plan I came up with would have a very different flavor from like in the engineer sitting next to me. So that might be
Right.
an interesting.
Yep. For sure.
Do that and then tell me about it because that's cool. But anyways, ideation happens. The engineer gets a plan that he or she deems sufficiently rich, and that is the input. And I think the input, like you're using infrastructure that you already have working, like Jira, is kind of like the holding place for this. And that's where Scarif is, okay, I see a new task. Or probably an engineer says, hey, Scarif, get to work. And then Scarif goes to a planning phase on its own, and it's Claude code, but it goes to a planning phase. It builds it out according to certain foundational opinions that you guys have started with. Let's definitely touch into that.
Yep.
And once it feels like it's done, it goes to a review stage, which is actually, that's fairly dark for you guys, dark factory. You don't have humans looking at lines of code. So I want to get in a little bit. I want to get into like how we're confident that blah, 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 all the things that we should be confident about. But it's apparently pretty good. If it says yes, then it goes on to emerging deployment, which can be automated, depends. And if it's bad, it kicks it back to the previous step. Have I missed any like big obvious things?
I think you got it. I mean, the only thing to say about the architecture is it's, the Scarif itself, kind of there's a back end to it, which is, living in the cloud, Rails app running in AWS. And then there's kind of similar to GitHub Actions in a way, there's worker nodes, there's basically a harness around Claude code to, claim work from the system and work it, report completion, that sort of thing. Um, yeah, and the choice of keeping things tied to Jira was a deliberate one, just because that currently is how our human engineers work, and
Yeah.
how clients expect to see progress in the system is Jira tickets moving. And so the idea is, you know, maybe not every ticket is suitable for Scarif to work on. You know, for example, one that has a lot of configuration to it. It's like, okay, well, someone besides Scarif is going to have to go click around in Google Cloud Console to get OAuth set up, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so if those are both in the same system, we can track all of the work together. It all can kind of move together. We have Scarif will dump things out into our, essentially what amounts to our internal review column. So that's saying, someone internally needs to look at this. So normally for our human process, a developer implements something, and then we want someone other than them to go look at it and make sure, okay, based on this story, this is what I see deployed, good or not. And then it goes to a client. After that is okay, now the client needs to go, all right, go look at volatile, make sure that this is what you meant. This is what we thought you meant, that sort of thing. So there's
Yeah.
still, we haven't automated the full life cycle yet for a client project. There's still we still need eyes on it. It's just in a different way. It's like a verification of the output in a way. Like,
Yeah,
did
Very.
this
I
did
think
this build what we thought it would?
your mention of the design review, I think is worth revisiting too, because like functionally, we can get well-tested features out of what we've got and they work. But as a user, you're like, oh my God, like nothing is styled in this section for some reason. And,
Or
so
it's
there
not
are,
styled the same as everything else. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So there is a lot of that we have to deal with too. Yeah. And I think a key part of this is just we've, a part of the reason that we have integrated with the tool chain we already had is, our mentality around what the factory is doing is it's like a teammate. It is not as good as a human developer. It can't go get the context that people can get as easily. It can't, lean on the memory it has. I feel like memory in general is still a,
Yeah.
work in progress. Yeah. But in general, like it's like having an intern or a junior developer where you can offload some set of tasks and then you probably still want that senior person with experience and knowledge to go give it a real look and make sure things are good. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that framing too. That's one thing that's come up a lot for me in building AI products with my clients is what is the intuition that you can have about this thing? And the best intuition I can communicate is to intentionally anthropomorphize the freaking thing, to say it's like our nice AI intern, really smart, forgetful. But that's implies exactly what you're talking about. What would a person on their first day of the job need to have in front of them so that they can reasonably do their jobs? What tools should they have? And this poor fellow, he's going to wake up tomorrow and he's not going to remember anything. So he won't. We'll get into memory later if you'd like to. I think that's also a fascinating topic in a place where until Mila Jovovich released her repo yesterday,
Yeah,
we
I
Well,
saw
were
that
lost.
that was released. Haven't had a chance to look at it yet. That'd be
oh,
interesting.
I don't know what that is,
Yeah.
but it's not real. That's my personal opinion. Um, all right, so
well,
let's back to factories. Let's dig into this a little bit. Um, when you're implementing this thing, so I know that the nodes are basically Claude code, but are you programming the knowledge of all these things as skills? Are these all like skills, or how are you encoding each one of these steps into something that works?
Yeah. So, okay, there's probably like three moving parts here to talk about. So one, kind of to get back to, treating it like a teammate and using the tools that our team uses. We actually have a Twin Sun Cloud Code plugin that we use internally, which has, a bunch of skills and agents around, development, debugging, reviewing, those sorts of things. So the worker nodes have that installed, so they have all of those available, and you see it leaning on those sometimes. And then the second part of that is kind of related, but there's in that plugin, we actually have a kind of a setup task for a repo where it's like you want to set up this task to use the plugin well, to use AI well. And what it does is it will add these AI rule sets that we developed. The impetus for this was the Flutter team actually released something similar to this, which became a seed, where it's just a long markdown file of, if you're using an AI agent with Flutter, here's like all of the best practices to tell it to have it in context. And so I took that and then it's like, okay, well, we don't do Flutter exactly the same way everyone else does. So, hey, Claude, look at look at our base apps, look at our, some of our recent work and come up with, use this as the base and then add like a Twin Sun specific section at the bottom. That's like, okay, now there are the general rules. Now here are the specifics of how we like to do things. So a good example is there's a very common pattern in Flutter development called block, which are the business logic components. And we do it somewhat differently than the more popular packages for it out there do it. We don't, it's not super important to get into the details of that right now, but what's important is it is different. And so if come into a project and know that we're doing block, know that we're doing Twin Sun block, produces different results than if you just said, hey, Claude, do block, it's probably going to pull a block package off of pub.dev and set that up and whatever, rather than just follow our existing pattern that's here. Um, and so then, okay, so we have that for Flutter. Okay, great. Now let's do one for Rails. Do a little research, find, on both in our base app and, the internet at large for best practices and things like that. Come up, here's the Flutter one. Make it like this, but for Rails. Make it like this, but for Node. Make it like this, but for what was the other PHP, I guess. Laravel is the other one I did. So those are kind of the more common technologies that we use. And so then this Cloud Code plugin has a setup task that it's like, okay, figure out which platforms we're using, pull in the right rule sets, add them to the claude.md. That way, we always have those. And so that kind of provides some of that baseline context for, when you're implementing or planning or whatever, you should be looking at these files that tell you generally how to do things and then go from there.
Okay, so Claude Code, and you guys are stretching Claude Code more than
Yes.
I have. I've been a Cursor fanboy, and they're still good. I like them, but
Yeah.
Claude Code has got all the light right now. So Claude Code wakes up, and it's already got these packages installed, plugins. I'm sorry, installed. Let's say describe certain types of agents. I guess certain types of. Did you say the word skills? Are you using skills in
So
this?
yeah, there are skills in that plugin, and the third piece is the actual prompt, that's in Scarif that Scarif will build for whatever various stage it's doing, and there's a little bit of variation depending on what technology you're using, what MCPs are available, that sort of thing. But yeah,
Right.
for
So
most purposes, it's roughly a static prompt.
got it. So Claude Code wakes up whenever it receives the prompt from Scarif.
Mhm.
That's here's the plan. Here's the thing you're doing
Yep.
today. Part of the setup script is okay. I got it, but also what kind of repo is this? And let's start just downloading documents. I guess about if you're doing Rails, here's the rules of the road. If you're doing Node, here's the rules of the road.
Yep.
And I'm not familiar with BLC, but it's just is this like the programming paradigm where it's like you have an API layer, service layer, a repository layer, something like that. It's like here's
Yeah,
the
very very similar to that, just Flutter specific jargon basically.
okay, okay,
Yeah.
that's cool. And by giving it these opinions, you keep it on much easier confined rails. You know where it's going to go. It gets, I presume, it gets better results.
Yeah. Right. For
I,
sure.
I will say one thing that we benefit from on most of our projects is our base app templates. Like we do a lot of greenfield work, a lot of new projects, and those templates have been in the works for years and have given us starting point implementations for a lot of things like organization and user management, access controls, Stripe, payment integration, push notifications, like all kinds of crazy stuff, dashboards, reporting. And the side effect of having that as your starting point is Claude has tons of good examples for design patterns, the architecture we use, the infrastructure we deploy, so that base template is just loads, dozens and dozens of feature examples. So when it goes to implement a new service class, it's looking at what are the service classes already in this project, and it follows our conventions just kind of organically from that alone, which we do see a much better result from that just inherent context of what is in the app already than we'd get from just a brand new app that hasn't had that benefit of all those learnings over the years.
That's huge. That makes a lot of sense. So effectively, you get the 1-2 punch. You have the instructions that say, here's what you should do, but also to like harken back to prompt engineering when it was the thing. But you've got the few shot examples, and the few shot examples is your whole repo. You've got all these good
Right.
examples about what I mean when I say do this exact thing. And that I'm sure that helps it stay on the rails much better. Here's a question that I've been wondering about in my own work developing prototypes and stuff. It's tempting just to say, hey, build the product, build the thing, and I'll have a little bit too much of just like my product hat on, how would a user use this? And I think about like an interface. And then I get into a situation where I like hem myself in and I built something that technically satisfies the user interface, but the backend code, the server code is just garbage. I've obviously learned to be a little more deliberate about no, we want to have an API layer, and here's a reasonable interface. If I can define that, then other stuff plugs into it. Here's a service layer. It controls the business logic itself. I want the database to be pluggable. So like I might have a repository layer that you can just replace this thing and you get a different database or different data model even. But I have to be very intentional about that in the work that I've done lately. Maybe it's because I'm not using like a good skill that says here's what you should do and here's like a good example. But when your developers are working through these things, how much guidance are they providing Scarif about the less visible things that they're working on and that are important to extensibility and modularity and stuff like that?
I think part of it comes down to comfort level with the project and just this new class of tooling too. So one project I know recently, Jami asked the team for task level specification on everything in the product we were going to build. It was a small fixed price effort, and he ran it all through Scarif. And going back to that configurability, the team needed to PR review that because it was the entire application. And so a lot of their time, went to, does this match what we expected to build? And it was kind of funny. The first pass of this, the team came back and said, hey, we're rejecting most of the PRs Scarif made because it did what we specified and we specified the wrong thing. And so we do have a lot of learning around that of like how important is that and what is the cost of iterating on it, things like that. And I think like the realization we keep coming to as we've iterated on these ideas and as we prototyped is just how cheap code is in this new paradigm where on Scarif itself, Jami I think has a fantastic ability and discerning eye for like looking at a system and understanding it or designing a system. And I don't have that. I have the like, I'm going to try a bunch of crazy ideas. And so our initial attempt at a factory was I built this, to your point, really cool UI. It doesn't really work. What might you learn from that? And so in extreme programming, there's this notion of tracer bullets where maybe you're firing a machine gun in the dark. You can't see where you're shooting. The tracer bullets light up and you see kind of the direction of things. And I think I like to pretend at least that prototyping and iterating on that was valuable to Jami. And he's like, I actually see where we should go because he definitely has a keen eye for that and built the right thing. But I think that's something in general across all of our projects where we're saying, for a lot of these, especially in tech stacks we're not familiar with or not using a lot, we do still have to have that kind of tracer mentality of we're probably going to have to take a few hits at this. But I think the thing, LLMs afford us is experiments are cheap and easy now, and we can do more and do it quickly. So it's not even necessarily the end goal is not, oh, we're just going to complete stuff automatically and never look at it. It's more, we're going to stretch time and budgets more by increasing what we can accomplish in the same amount of time or with the same amount of money. So we're still kind of working through that on a lot of projects.
Well, that initial, yeah, I think your prototyping was really useful, Dave, because I made another Discord bot, because why not Discord bots? But it's kind of like, okay, are we ready to be like truly self-modifying yet, kind of thing. And so it was a Discord bot that I would chat to it and we could have a conversation, going back and forth, and then it could make a pull request, whatever, approve it, let's have more conversations, all that. So that was kind of a fun that was my first kind of foray into that while Dave was kind of building his factories, and he kind of went top down, a little more generic. And so based on, kind of his frustrations and my experience with this, very narrowly tailored kind of Discord bot, it's like, okay, maybe if we start smaller and build our way up, it'll be a little more successful than trying to come at it, build the whole thing all at once.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So it's maybe Dave, you had in mind like, okay, we got it's a cyclic graph, and you just like, we know we got to build the code, and we know we got to review the code, and we got to deploy the code, and so you can build all these boxes. But if you keep them completely generic, then you're basically giving the Claude code enough rope to hang itself with. And what you guys found out by trying stuff, your XP tracer bullets, is okay. Obviously, it's not good enough yet, but from patterns that you guys had already seen, if you keep it on if you take the entire world of possibilities and narrow it down to just a much smaller space, then it's okay. It's less likely to be creative and do things
Yeah.
the wrong way.
And that is precisely like I think a core lesson I learned from seeing Jamie's implementation versus, all my iterations, because I was doing a DAG, directed acyclic graph. Then I had to introduce cycles because it wasn't doing a great job. And, Jamie's approach was, I don't need all that. Like our workflow is very straightforward. Here are the steps. Yeah, we've got conditional stuff for languages or frameworks, but he's like, you're just very much giving it too much rope. So I started with, in one iteration, a planning step where, it was a YAML based configuration and Claude would do the planning step, which would generate YAML for execution. And it always did a worse job than the standard execution steps Jamie had. And so I eventually gave up on that one. But yeah, it's very much, he saw the field and refined it down to what we really needed. And that opinionated approach definitely has made it easier, I think, to make real progress on getting this thing running.
Maybe let's take a pause for a second. I've got plenty of things that I want to ask, but I want to make sure that you guys are the ones building this thing, what's working, and the pain points too. Top of mind for you guys that it's going to be important for us to nail in this conversation.
Well, if you want to go, I have something too.
I'm going to say pain point wise, the design review thing is we should touch on because I think that's probably a big pain point that a lot of people feel um, with this stuff is, Claude doesn't see the way we see, right? If you give it a picture of your design that looks great and its implementation that looks kind of like what we put in, it sometimes it can pick out what was wrong, maybe, or some of it, it doesn't do a great job if it's looking at this like large image, especially just static images, whatever. Um,
Interesting.
and so that design, but that's very important for us because, our product development process, a client comes in, they work with our designer, they spend a lot of time, working with her, refining like what should this look like visually, how should it feel, how should it work, those sorts of things. We can't have Claude just spit out, something that's like, yeah, and be like, ah, this is good, right? That's what you want. So that was kind of an interesting, like almost research project in terms of like, okay, you know, everyone's trying to do this. Like, what can we do here? That sort of thing. And so it's more time consuming and results in more cycles, but we get a much better result with, this design review stage we've got now, which is kind of like two pieces to it. There's kind of like the code up kind of piece that's going, okay, let me pull down all of like the design tokens from Figma and Zeppelin, so we know, okay, what colors are we supposed to be using? What's the border radius supposed to be? What's the spacing supposed to be? All that stuff. And then go look at the code, like in our Tailwind configuration, make sure that matches the designs, start running it, use Playwright to pull out like the computed CSS on elements and make sure those are matching, we're using the design tokens in the right places, all that kind of stuff. And then the other side is kind of like a visual review, but instead of going, okay, compare this image to that image, it's like, okay, look at the implementation of the screen, divide it into like regions that you can compare independently, and then within those regions, divide it into components, and then start looking at, okay, here's the components and how do they match up? Have we used the right ones? Have we put them in the right places? That sort of thing. And it's still not 100% perfect. I don't want to give that impression, but it is a much better result at the end of that than just doing nothing, certainly, or even just doing like screenshot to design kind of one-to-one comparison.
So very much right now we're talking about just the graphical design of things. It's a particular pain point because of
Yeah.
the guardrails you put it on, the like code design, all that stuff. That's doing pretty well.
Yeah.
But when you're looking at the design and the Claude code doesn't see the way humans see, when you break it down into like pieces, is that still at least visual? Do you say take a screenshot of these three components on the screen, compare it with the designs? How
Yeah,
are
it's
you making it more accurate? That seems like a really challenging problem.
yeah, I mean ultimately it's kind of, to go back to your prompt engineering, it's like a prompt engineering thing. There's some scripts for how to like pull out design tokens and things, but largely it's just a big prompt that's like do these two things. Go, look at the design tokens from Figma and Zeppelin, compare them to the code, make sure, compare them to the computed CSS, all of that kind of stuff, and then visually doing these breakdowns. And it is still, it's running the application. That in itself is kind of an interesting pain point that had to be solved because it doesn't do a great job of cleaning up after itself all the time. So it's like, okay, there's now a pre-warming step where the scaffolding around Claude Code scans for a block of like 10 ports that are open together, above 3000. Then we inject that into the prompt. Like, okay, run the app. When you do it, use, ports 3010 through 3020 kind of thing. You can pick whatever you want in there. Just because I try to, we've got like multiple nodes running on the same machine kinds of stuff.
Interesting. That's a
And
very
so they conflict and they'll kill each other sometimes. Like Claude can be very persistent about it. So like I've seen them kill each other's Claude processes to try to like free up ports so they can run things. Like stop doing that.
that's wild. Yeah, I thought
But
about
yeah,
that. But yeah, obviously that would be a like this design looks nothing like the design that you asked me
so it's
for.
just like this error page of like an
Oh,
old Rails app that was running, but now the temp directory has been cleaned up. It's not, it doesn't look anything like it, of course.
oh, that's that.
But
Okay.
yeah,
I,
well, when it runs things correctly, it will go in, take a screenshot, divide it up, even section that into images and compare like, okay, did we get this button right? Did we get this card right? That kind of stuff.
think like just in prompting to say, check the computed styles and the rendered DOM for this page and ensure it matches your expectations and is consistent with the rest of the design. Like that does a lot in itself. But yeah, Jamie's taking it very far on the visual analysis aspect too. But that alone, just check the structure, check how it actually rendered, oftentimes cleans up a lot of obvious visual defects.
I think this is one of those things where it's like, Pareto principle kind of things. Like you get 80% of the result with the easy prompt, and then if you get to do a lot of hard stuff to kind of get like the next nine kind of thing,
Yeah.
And then a random cloud update on Tuesday will replace it all. So
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Claude's going to come out with their visual design implementer, in a couple
Next
of
week
weeks and
as we
just
spoke
make it
this
all,
into the
yeah.
yeah, if you want it sooner, then I better publish this sooner so that they'll
Right.
have agents listening to podcast and be like, oh, that's a good idea. We'll just make that.
Yeah.
um, yeah. Well, I think we don't have to hit it right now, but I have thought, we're talking a lot about the technical implementation of a factory, but I'm sure in your line of work, John, you probably hit this too. There's also the adoption aspect and the comfort
Mm.
level people have, right? Which has been interesting in general with AI for us as a development agency. But you know, going into like the disciplined culture aspect of, we needed a discipline across the organization to give us the ability to do what we've done so far. And part of that is in hiring and having the team we have. Most of our team, they're second career developers. They've already had a significant change in their profession. Bartenders, musicians, teachers, a law librarian. Again, Jamie had a PhD in biochemistry, a very diverse group of people, but they all came from different fields and have already made the jump once into technology. They learned programming, they learned to do it the traditional way. And then all of a sudden, a couple of years in, AI comes out and can spit out, you know, thousands of lines of code in the time they can do a dozen. And so I think having those people on board has, been a big deal for us. They're open and receptive to, a changing field because they've been through it. They're willing to adapt and they're willing to try and see like, is there something here that can make this work well for us? So I've personally known a lot of first career developers, several friends of mine even that feel completely differently about all this technology and have had a different result. And, we, like Jamie and I think of it as they're too focused on watching the sausage get made. And I've been compelled, as an experienced developer too, to say, wait a minute, Claude, stop, don't do that, do it this other way. But oftentimes when you let it go and just let it run for a bit, it can reassess and correct those problems eventually without you touching it at all. And especially, with the workflow we have with PR reviewer, design review, CI feedback, that's been a big differentiator too. But just being open and trying new things is a big deal for the team. That's really driven adoption.
Very interesting. So it's the second time I've heard this spoken in the last 2 days, that for some reason the people that come from unusual backgrounds tend to be more receptive and even potentially capable. And that's interesting. I guess maybe it is exactly what you said, and I'm one of those myself. It's just the fact that there has been a big leap in the past to be like, okay, this is just another big leap. I've
Yeah.
done one of those before. Very interesting. So much to talk about on this one, and figure out where you want to take this conversation, Dave and Jamie. But the morale of not seeing code and just everything changing, who moved my cheese, but it's a really big block of cheese this time. What roles are on the chopping block versus what roles are emerging? Especially in the olden days, we had dedicated engineers, dedicated product managers, which didn't know much about code and sometimes struggle to get people to listen to their good ideas. Project managers that are like wiring stuff together, that might have a very different role at this point. People managers, and even up in the higher level. Yeah, so where do you want to take this conversation? Because I think this is adopting the technology is very important.
Yeah, I think like when we ask what roles are being replaced on the chopping block, I still think of it at a task level. I think where we've seen some success so far, and there is a certain threshold of task or a type of task where you don't have to write that code. And I think we kind of benefit again in how we've selected the people that are on our team. That's the expectation from day one. Is not, we don't care, like we care about code quality, but we don't necessarily care about the code over the outcome or the business impact. And unfortunately, I think there is definitely a morale hit for a lot of people where they enjoy programming. It turns out developers like to develop, but I've also had the take that development has kind of taken a narrower and narrower definition than I think it should have. I mean, especially if you look at like the Agile Manifesto, it's about communication and collaboration. It's about achieving those outcomes. It's very much not focused on we write great code, it is quality code, most of our time is code. It's really what are we trying to achieve and what tooling helps us achieve that. And so I feel generally like the folks we have accepted that, if not embraced it. I think most have embraced it. And I think it's really almost empowering a lot of time when you can say, I've got this really hairy task I need to go implement, and I'm just going to be typing for 3 hours. If you look at it at a high level, like that's not a very exciting thing. You want the accomplishment at the end, but the task of typing out the syntax is really, honestly, I think one of the least valuable things our team does. They are great thinkers. They look at projects globally. They try to think strategically about, what's really the right thing to do for my client here. So I think we do benefit uniquely in the way we've hired with that.
Are people that are focused on outcomes.
Yes.
And that when you say it out loud, it seems obvious. But I'm a developer too. I've done down like the byte level coding in the past, and that's
Sure.
the funnest puzzle there is.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. Like, I don't think people, I think there will always be a place for programming. And, people knit sweaters. It's not the cheapest or most efficient way to get a sweater, but it's still really cool. But I think there's also just meta programming around, these factories. Like, yeah, you can, bootstrap them like Jamie has described, and they can build a lot themselves. But there are some decisions where you probably do want to get your hands dirty and make sure things are exacting and specific. And I think that will just always exist. So I think it's programming on a different level that, that will continue for quite some time.
Yep. And there's always this weird side market for artisanally created code, right?
Yeah. free range organic software. Let's do it.
Touch the keyboard with my hands. If you guys have got the problem that I've got right now, where you used to rub off the S and the D and the space bar and the like shift, and now I'm like rubbing off the option character where I just push it down and start yelling at my computer.
My bigger problem is I open a terminal window and I start typing in English. I'm in quad, right? Like I just start going. But
okay, so I don't want to leave this topic too quickly because there's another aspect of it. One thing that I wanted to make sure we get to that's going to be especially important to all the companies out there that are trying to figure out how to navigate this is not just how you implement this culturally, but also like technologically. You came from a starting point. Technology is moving. It's moving so fast that you can't like aim for where the puck is right now. You've got to aim ahead. You start from a particular starting point. Would you recommend that a company that has an established development practice incrementally move to something that's like a factory?
And I think we'll hit on some of the same themes. What allowed us to do it is do you have the solid process discipline in place? So if you've got a good software development process that works for your human developers, and you start with automating the pieces, you can. So you start with automated code reviews. Once you're confident in those, now you don't need to do the human reviews, or not in every case, and then you start moving up the chain. You've got, if your automated testing is going well, you can be confident in the code you're shipping. And so, then, all right, now maybe we can take our hands back a little bit, let Claude go loose, start automating the easy tasks. Okay, we had good results from those. Now we can move a little harder. We need to, the design review piece is going to be that's going to be a pain point. So those UI tasks that are, build out a whole screen exactly to these visual requirements, that'll be a little bit of a challenge. That's probably the hurdle to get over to really start making it able to do more, because most tasks involve some level of UI work. So what I see is, that process discipline, and then using that to allow you to start automating pieces of it confidently.
like one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately, John, is one of the first things we discussed when we first met. I don't know if you remember this, but I was kind of whining about how no one does evals and just kind of like throws random prompts at the wall and assumes it's going to work in production. And you told me no one wants to eat their vegetables. And
Great.
and I think that's a wonderful description of software development in general. Like no one wants to eat their vegetables. Like, are you doing, security checks that you should be doing every night? Or are you looking at accessibility? And I think one quick win for people that are critical of introducing these tools to like their core tasks could be saying, hey, you need to make sure you're doing security scans every night. And Dependabot is kind of annoying. Claude is way better at handling these minor upgrades for you. And you can have a nice PR in the morning that says, hey, the CVE came out. It's already addressed. Here you go. Test pass. This is work you wouldn't have done this quarter if you didn't have this. I think that could be a nice low barrier to entry too. Maybe not the, I guess, the low hanging fruit that otherwise people just aren't going to worry about or prioritize. Just take care of it and show like there is value here for a subset of tasks. And then it's easy to ask, well, okay, if it can do that, what else could it do for us?
Interesting. So you guys are saying something similar, but it's like from a starting point, you have a bunch of tasks at your work that you do, and you need to start probably as like a priority queue of this one sucks for us, but it is doable. And then, like when you have something that's drudgery, like doing upgrades that Claude Code is really good at, and no one really feels like doing and working out the little minor bugs that pop up, then you can just start. You know what I think about? When I was a young lad, I asked my financial advisor I was like, I'm an entrepreneur. I've always been a wannabe. And you should read this book, Michael Gerber's E-Myth. Have you heard of that?
Yeah. Richard King. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not really about startups, but it's about like franchise restaurants. And I don't want to own a McDonald's, but it's talking about the same thing you're talking about. It just came to me right now.
Hmm.
Is the whole idea of that book is you go to your business, you lay out the tasks at hand, and you write like a binder. Or here's the employee binder. Here's what you do when you get in this task, and we've completely outlined a role. You fire yourself from that role and go do more important high utilization stuff ahead of that. So,
Yeah.
so
That
weirdly, it's like running a franchise hamburger joint.
that
Um,
that that does open up one final thought I've had that we haven't touched on at all, which is we're talking software factories, and I think that's definitely the sweet spot for LLMs right now. Like we are in the best field for automation with AI right now, I think. But there's a whole other class of factories people are doing. I'm not a fan of this one. I saw someone making a book factory where they're just generating books. I'm like, please don't. But there are other use cases. So like even in our marketing, I think Jamie had the idea of, we have all this built up knowledge about all these projects, all these clients we've worked with, and we've never written any of it down. He's like, I'm just going to task everyone with audio interviews. I have a list of questions, talk about your project. And he turned those into case study and blog post drafts that are grounded in real knowledge about projects we otherwise wouldn't write about. We just wouldn't take the time. And so now we have a nice draft to start from where we're just going to tweak them a bit and make it, sound like our language, our words, which is already close because it's translating from our audio. But, it's essentially a mini factory for case studies and deep dives. So I think there's a lot of new opportunity out there for a lot of fields, but we just get the benefit of it's really good at software. So everyone's talking about that right now.
yeah, yeah. Who knows what is going to happen? All right, let's close it up, guys. Thank you guys so much for being on the first ever podcast of whatever I'm going to call this. Thank you for being good conversational partners and teaching me and the 5 people that listen to this a lot about how to implement the factory pattern.
Thank you so
Well,
much, John. This has been fun.
yeah, thanks for having us. It was a lot of fun.